black limousine idled at the end of the gravel drive, exhaust curling like smoke from a fuse. Inside, a man in a tailored gray suit counted $100 bills onto a leather seat, his smile thin as wire. Across the field, an old veteran knelt in the soil, listening to something the wind carried, something the man with the money would never hear in time. Eli Mercer had a saying his grandfather taught him, repeated so often it became part of the fence posts and the rain gutters. A man's worth ain't measured in what he'll take. It's measured in what he won't sell. He'd said it to his daughter when she was 9, planting tomato starts beside him. He'd said it to himself in places he didn't talk about anymore. And on a warm Tuesday morning in late April, he was about to be reminded what those words really cost. Eli's farm sat at the bottom of a soft green valley in eastern Tennessee, 80 acres of bottomland that had belonged to Mercers since 1887. The farmhouse was white clapboard, 2 stories, with a porch that wrapped halfway around and a swing his late wife had painted sky blue 22 years ago. The paint was peeling now. He kept meaning to fix it. He kept not fixing it. At 63, Eli moved with the careful economy of a man who'd learned that hurrying mostly broke things. He woke before sunrise, drank black coffee from the same chipped mug, and walked his fields in a pair of boots older than his pickup. The pickup was a 1978 Ford, faded red, with a dent in the tailgate from the time his daughter Magnolia had backed into a fence post at 15. He'd left the dent there on purpose. His routine was simple. Mornings: tend the corn in the west field, check the tomatoes near the creek, water the small orchard of heirloom apples his grandmother had planted. Afternoons: repairs, fence mending, the slow, patient work of keeping 80 acres alive. Evenings: the porch swing, a glass of sweet tea, and the long blue dusk settling over the ridges. He had neighbors. Old Bart Sumner, who ran cattle on the next parcel and brought over jars of pickled okra nobody wanted but everybody accepted. The Whitaker family, who'd taken over the dairy operation down the road. A retired schoolteacher named Penelope Brooks, who lived in the converted mill at the bend in the creek and knew the name of every wildflower for 10 miles. They were quiet people. Eli liked them for that. What people didn't know, what Eli didn't talk about, was the Army. 2 tours in places that didn't make the news anymore. He came back in 1985 with a folded flag for his father, who'd passed while he was overseas, and a quietness that had settled into him like sediment. He didn't drink, he didn't tell stories. He grew things. The growing was the point. His daughter Magnolia called every Sunday from Knoxville, where she worked as a paralegal and was raising a 7-year-old boy named June. She visited when she could. She worried about her father living alone out there. "Daddy, you ought to think about coming closer to town." He'd laugh and tell her he was closer to where he needed to be than he'd ever been. She'd sigh. They'd talk about June. They'd hang up. The valley would go quiet again. The black limousine arrived on a Tuesday in late April, just after Eli had finished his second cup of coffee. He heard it before he saw it. The low purr of an old V8, the crunch of expensive tires on gravel that didn't expect gravel. He set his mug on the porch rail and watched it come up the long drive, a 1992 Lincoln stretch with tinted windows and a hood ornament that caught the morning sun. A young man stepped out of the back, maybe 30, slim, sharp-featured, dressed in a gray suit too warm for the weather. He carried a briefcase in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. He smiled the way salesmen smile, which is to say with his teeth but not his eyes. "Mr. Mercer?" the young man called out, walking toward the porch. "My name is Sutton Vance. I have an offer for you." Eli didn't get up from the swing. He nodded toward the second porch chair, the one with the cane seat that needed reweaving. Sutton Vance sat, brushing imaginary dust from his trousers, and set the leather satchel on the floor between his polished shoes. "I represent Crestline Holdings," Vance began, and the words came out rehearsed. "We're a development firm out of Nashville. We've been looking at this valley for some time, Mr. Mercer. The location, the water table, the proximity to the new highway corridor. It's exceptional. Eli sipped his coffee. He waited. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer," Vance continued. He unbuckled the satchel and lifted out a thick stack of banded $100 bills. Then another, and another, arranging them on the small wicker table between them. $2.4 million, cash today. The check is also available if you'd prefer, but I find people respond better to the tangible. Eli looked at the money. He looked at the young man. He looked back out at the field, where a red-tailed hawk was circling slow above the south pasture. "That's a lot of money," Eli said. "It is. What would you do with the land?" Vance smiled, more warmly now. "Mixed-use development. Light commercial along the road frontage, residential's clusters up the hillside. We'd preserve some of the green space, of course. Walking trails. A pond, perhaps. There's already a pond. A larger one," Eli set down his mister. "Vance, I appreciate you coming all the way out here. That's a fair offer for someone who wanted to sell. I don't," the smile thinned. "Mercer, with respect, this is more than the land is worth on the open market. Considerably more. You could buy a much nicer property somewhere else. A condominium in Florida. A house closer to your daughter in Knoxville." Eli's eyes lifted just slightly. He hadn't mentioned a daughter. He hadn't mentioned Knoxville. "I know where I'd like to be," Eli said. "I'm in it." Vance leaned forward, the rehearsed warmth slipping. "Mr. Mercer, the highway extension is happening. The growth is coming. You can be part of it, or you can be left behind. 3 million. Final offer. Mr. Vance." Eli stood. He was not a tall man, but he was solid, and standing he seemed to take up the whole porch. "Pack that money back into your satchel. Drive back to Nashville. Tell your people the land isn't for sale. It wasn't for sale when my grandfather was offered the same thing in 1962, and it isn't for sale now." Vance stood too. He did not smile. "Mr. Mercer," he said softly, "you'll regret this." Vance walked back to the limousine with stiff, deliberate steps. The driver opened the door. The young man paused with one foot inside the car, looked back at the farmhouse, and for a moment his face was not the face of a salesman at all. It was the face of someone who had never been told no and had decided that no was a problem with a solution. The limousine rolled back down the drive and disappeared past the line of sycamores. Eli stood on the porch a long time after it was gone. The hawk was still circling. The wind was still moving through the new corn. But something had shifted in the morning. The way the air shifts before a storm, you can't yet see on the horizon. Magnolia called that evening, which was unusual for a Tuesday. Her voice was tight in a way Eli recognized from her childhood, when something at school had upset her, and she was trying not to say so. "Daddy, June's been asking when he can come stay with you again. For the summer. Maybe a few weeks. He's welcome whenever." There was a pause. "I might come too. Things here, work's been hard. I just want to be somewhere quiet for a while. Then come home. I will. Soon." Eli hung up and sat on the porch as the lightning bugs began to rise from the long grass. For the next 2 weeks, the valley returned to something resembling normal, though Eli kept one eye on the road. He didn't expect Sutton Vance to come back personally. Men in suits with limousines rarely did their own dirty work, but he watched anyway. It was a habit older than the farm. He spent the mornings in the corn. The west field was his pride. 3 acres of an heirloom yellow dent. His grandfather had bred for this soil specifically, a strain that didn't exist anywhere else in the country. He'd kept the seed alive for 41 years, replanting from the best ears each fall, drying them in the loft of the barn, saving the lineage one season at a time. The corn was already knee-high, and the deepest, healthiest green he'd seen in years. He walked the rows every morning, hands trailing the leaves, listening to the soft, papery whisper of them. The tomatoes were coming on, too. He'd put in 80 plants near the creek, a mix of Brandywine, Cherokee Purple, and a yellow variety his wife had loved called Hillbilly. He staked them with hand-cut cedar posts and tied them with strips of old T-shirts, the way his mother had taught him. In the afternoons, he worked on the pickup. The carburetor had been running rough for a month, and he'd finally ordered a rebuild kit from a parts catalog. He spread newspaper on the gravel of the side yard, laid out his tools, and took the carburetor apart piece by piece, soaking the components in a coffee can of solvent. He worked slowly, the way his father had worked. There was no hurry. There was just the work, and the work was its own reward. June arrived on a Saturday. Magnolia drove him up in her little blue sedan, helped him out with his backpack and his fishing rod, and a stuffed rabbit he was officially too old for, but had not yet been willing to leave behind. He came running across the gravel, and Eli scooped him up. The boy was lighter than he should have been, all elbows and bony knees, and set him back down. "Granddad, can we fish today?" "Tomorrow morning. Today we're going to fix the truck." "Yes." Magnolia stayed for dinner. She looked tired in a way that made Eli's chest tight. She'd been working 60-hour weeks on a case that wasn't going well, she said. Her ex-husband, June's father, a man Eli had never warmed to, was making noise about custody again. She didn't elaborate. Eli didn't press. He made pork chops and cornbread and snapped green beans from the garden, and they ate on the porch while June described in detail every fish he intended to catch. She left the next morning. June stayed. The week that followed was the kind of week Eli kept folded in the back of his mind for the harder days. He and June fished the creek and caught 2 small bream and a stick. They drove into town in the pickup and got ice cream at the little place by the courthouse. They worked on the carburetor together. June handed him wrenches and asked questions about every single bolt. They sat on the porch in the evenings, and Eli taught him the names of the constellations, and June, 6 years old, told him about a planet he had personally invented called Glorp, where everyone rode dinosaurs to school. On the 8th morning, Penelope Brooks came over with a basket of muffins and a worried expression. "Ellie," she said, settling onto the porch swing, "I had a fellow knock on my door yesterday. Said he was with some development company. Asked if I'd be willing to sell. Offered me a number that nearly made me drop my teacup." "What'd you tell him?" "I told him my husband and I bought that mill in 1981, and I plan to die there. Then I closed the door." Eli smiled. "Good." He went up to Bart's after and the Whitakers. Word is they all said no, but he was real interested in the Whitakers' place because it shares your west fence line. "Did he say anything else?" Penelope hesitated. "He said it was a shame folks couldn't see the bigger picture. He said sometimes things change whether folks like it or not." Eli filed that away. He thanked her for the muffins. He watched her walk back across the field toward the mill, her white hair bright as a flag in the sun. That night, June fell asleep on the porch swing with his head against Eli's shoulder. Eli sat very still, the cicadas loud in the trees, the small, warm weight of his grandson real and present, and worth more than any number any man in a suit could put on a satchel. He listened to the valley breathe. He waited. The 3rd week of June's stay, Eli took him out to the west field at dawn. The corn was waist-high now, and the morning fog was lifting off the rows in long, pale ribbons. June stood at the edge with his rabbit tucked under one arm, mouth open. "It looks like a green ocean. That's a pretty good description. Can we walk in it?" They walked in it. Eli showed him how to read the leaves, the slight curl that meant the plant wanted water, the deep glossy green that meant the soil was right, the small holes that meant a beetle was thinking about moving in. June listened with his whole body, the way only children listen. He asked questions Eli hadn't been asked since Magnolia was small. "Why do the rows go that way and not that way?" "Because the slope drains east. If we planted across the slope, the rain would wash the seed out." "Why does corn have those little hairs at the top?" "That's the silk. Each strand connects to one kernel. The pollen comes down from the tassel and rides the silk down to make the kernel." "Every kernel?" "Every single one." June considered this. "That's a lot of work for the corn." "It is." They were near the middle of the field when Eli noticed it. A faint sweetness in the air that didn't belong, not the green smell of corn or the wet smell of fog, but something chemical, sharp at the back of his throat. He stopped walking. He bent down and looked at the base of a stalk. The leaves at the bottom were curling, the edges browning in a way that didn't match anything natural. He stood up slowly. He looked down the row, then the next row, then the next. "Granddad? Hold on, buddy." He walked 20 paces in. The browning was patchy but unmistakable, spreading in irregular blotches across about a third of the field. The deepest damage was along the eastern edge, nearest the road. He knelt and rubbed soil between his fingers. It felt right. He smelled it. It smelled wrong, a faint kerosene edge under the loam. He walked June out of the field and sat him on the porch with a glass of milk and a coloring book. Then he went to the barn, got his soil test kit and a clean glass jar, and went back to the west field. He took samples from 6 locations, labeled them with a grease pencil, and drove the truck. The carburetor was running smooth now, into town. The county extension office sat above a hardware store. The agent on duty was a young woman named Sage Holloway, whom Eli had known since she was in 4-H. She looked at the samples, looked at Eli's face, and stopped smiling. "Ellie, what happened out there? That's what I'm asking you." She ran a preliminary test in the back room while he waited. When she came out, she had a printout in her hand and her jaw was tight. "You've got herbicide contamination in the soil. A heavy concentration of something. I'd need to send it to the state lab to be sure. But my guess is a non-selective broadleaf killer mixed with something diesel-based to make it persist. This wasn't drift. This was applied, recently. Probably the last 72 hours. Eli felt the floor of his stomach drop a long way and then stop. How much of the field? Depends how much they used. If the contamination is mostly surface, you might lose a third of the crop. If it's leached down to the root zone across the whole field," she trailed off. The seed, she knew what he meant. She'd been at the harvest festival the year his grandfather's corn won the heirloom division. She knew what that seed line was. "Ellie," she said quietly, "if the contamination is in the root zone, this season's seed crop is gone. You'd be replanting next year from whatever's left in your loft. And if anything migrates into the soil reservoir, future crops too." He drove home slow. He didn't see the road. He saw 41 years of careful work, his grandfather kneeling in the rows, his father at 16 detasseling, himself at 7 walking behind a wagon. And he saw, beneath all of it, the face of Sutton Vance saying, "You'll regret this." When he got to the farmhouse, June was on the porch with his coloring book. Penelope was there too, having walked over to check on them. She looked at his face. "What is it?" he told her. She listened with her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, she said only this: "Ellie, you and I both know what kind of man does this. The question is what kind of man you're going to be and answer." He sat down on the porch swing. He looked out at the field that had been green that morning and would be brown by Friday. He didn't say anything for a long time. That night, after June was asleep, Eli sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a sharp pencil. He started a list. At the top, he wrote one word. Evidence beneath it, he wrote. Soil samples sent to state lab. Photos of damage, tire tracks along the east fence, check tomorrow at first light. Any security footage from the gas station at the county road junction. Any neighbors who saw an unfamiliar vehicle on the road between Monday and Wednesday. He paused. He wrote one more line. Crestline Holdings. Find the paperwork. Find the partners. Find the leverage. He set down the pencil. He looked at his reflection in the dark window over the sink. The quiet life was over. He had asked for it to stay. It hadn't. The next morning, Eli was in the east fence line at 5:30 with a flashlight and a camera. The tire tracks were exactly where he'd suspected, pressed into the soft shoulder where someone had pulled a vehicle off the gravel road and walked into the field. The tracks were wide and uneven, not a passenger car, some kind of utility vehicle. He photographed them from 4 angles, placed a quarter beside one print for scale, and photographed it again. He walked the fence line slowly. About 30 yards in, he found a small patch of crushed grass where someone had set down equipment. A faint chemical smell still hung in the air. He photographed the spot, took another soil sample, and bagged a piece of broken plastic, the corner of a label, white with a scrap of red lettering. He couldn't read the name, but he could see the letters STR, and below it, Ryle use, only he drove that sample, the plastic fragment, and the photographs into the county sheriff's office at 9 sharp. Deputy Holland, a heavy-set man in his 50s whom Eli had gone to high school with, took the report at his desk. He listened the whole way through without interrupting. When Eli finished, Holland tapped his pen on the desk. Ellie, I believe you. I also have to tell you, proving this is going to be hard. Whoever did this drove in from the road, didn't trespass on your house ground, and didn't leave a return address. Unless we can match that vehicle to somebody, or unless somebody talks, we're looking at a civil case at best. What about Crestline Holdings? Vance came to my house. 3 people saw him on the road that day. He threatened me when I refused. Holland nodded slowly. He said you'd regret it. That's not quite the same as a confession, and a sharp lawyer will say it referred to a business opportunity. But he set down the pen. I'll open a file. I'll call the state lab and tell them this is criminal mischief, not just a curiosity. I'll send a deputy out to take photographs of those tracks before they wash out. That's what I can do today. Thank you. Eli drove home. Penelope was on his porch when he got there, with a manila folder in her lap. I made some calls this morning, she said. Crestline Holdings is a shell corporation registered in Delaware. Sutton Vance is listed as a junior officer. The principal investors are harder to trace, but I have a friend at the Historical Society who used to work at the state archives, and she's pulling property records for every land assemblage Crestline has done in 3 states going back 5 years. Eli looked at her. Penelope, what? You used to teach 4th grade. She smiled, and it was a thin, sharp smile he had not seen on her before. I did. I also spent 12 years on the board of the Tennessee Land Trust before I retired. I know how these people work. They buy quiet. When quiet doesn't sell, they manufacture problems until people are tired enough to sell. I've seen it 3 times in this state alone. They are very good at it. They are also, in my experience, very confident, and confident people leave paper trails. Eli sat down beside her. How can I help? You keep your farm running. You take care of that grandson. You don't sell. You don't even look like you might sell. The minute they think pressure isn't working, they'll either escalate or back off. Either way, they'll make a mistake. Our job is to be ready when they do. Bart Suffner came over that afternoon with 2 of the Whitaker boys. Word had spread the way it spread in valleys like this, quietly, completely, and faster than any official channel. By sundown, 6 neighbors had walked the perimeter of Eli's land. 3 had volunteered to take overnight shifts watching the road from their own porches. Sage Holloway from the Extension Office called to say the state lab had agreed to expedite the analysis. That night, Eli walked the west field one more time, in the long blue dusk. The damage was worse already. Whole sections of the corn were drooping. He stood among the rows and put his hand on a stalk and held it there. On the 4th day after the contamination was discovered, the lab results came back. The herbicide was a restricted-use compound called Stricol, an industrial broadleaf killer, mixed with a petroleum carrier. Sage explained it on the phone in her careful, precise voice. Stricol was not sold to home gardeners. It required a commercial applicator's license. Every legal sale of it was tracked through a state registry. Anyone who'd bought it in the last 6 months in the eastern half of the state would be in that registry. That's the good news, she said. The bad news is the registry isn't public. We'd need either law enforcement or a court order to see it. Eli called Deputy Holland. Holland called the state. The state said it would take 2 weeks minimum to process the request. 2 weeks. The corn would be entirely gone by then. Penelope took the news on the porch with a cup of tea balanced on her knee. She did not look discouraged. She looked, in fact, slightly pleased. 2 weeks is fine, she said. We don't need the registry. We need Crestline to do something stupid. And I think we can encourage that. How? By letting them think you're starting to break. She laid out her plan that evening at the kitchen table, while June sat on the floor, reassembling a flashlight Eli had let him take apart. She would, she said, mention casually to a friend of hers in town, a woman who was a famously poor secret keeper, that Eli was meeting with an attorney about the possibility of a sale. She'd embellish that Eli was exhausted, that the field damage had broken him, that he was considering Vance's offer if it was still on the table. The rumor would reach Vance within 48 hours. Vance would not be able to resist. He would come back, and when he did, they would be ready. Ready how? Penelope said. Pocket recorder. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. He says one incriminating thing on your porch, we have it. And I'd very much like to have him on the porch when he says it. Eli looked at her for a long moment. Penelope, where did you learn this? Fourth graders, she said, are excellent practice for negotiating with grown men who think they're smarter than everyone in the room. The rumor went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday morning, the black limousine was back at the end of the gravel drive. Eli was on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and a small digital recorder in the chest pocket of his shirt. Penelope was inside with June, ostensibly making lunch, actually listening through the open window with a notepad. Bart Sumner was parked half a mile down the road in his pickup, watching the limo come and go. Deputy Holland was, by careful coincidence, at the county line on a routine patrol. Sutton Vance walked up the steps with the same rehearsed smile, the same satchel. Mr. Mercer, I was concerned to hear about the trouble with your crop. Truly unfortunate timing. I hope you've reconsidered our previous conversation. Have a seat. Vance sat. He opened the satchel. The stacks of money were thicker this time. 3.5 million. Final offer. I think we both understand that the value of farmland with, let's say, uncertain productivity has decreased somewhat. Eli sipped his tea. That's interesting phrasing. Uncertain productivity. How would you know about my productivity, Mr. Vance? The smile flickered. News travels in a small town, does it? Because the state lab only finished its analysis on Monday, and the only people who know there's a contamination problem are me, my neighbor across the way, the county extension agent, and the sheriff's deputy. I assumed, based on rumor, what rumor was that exactly? Vance's jaw tightened. Mr. Mercer, I came here in good faith. You came here, Eli said quietly, because you wanted to see if your handiwork had finally broken me. It hasn't. The corn isn't broken. The seed in my barn loft isn't broken. The neighbors aren't broken. The case file at the sheriff's office isn't broken. And I am not broken. So I'm going to ask you to leave my property, Mr. Vance. And I'd suggest you don't come back. Vance stood up. His face was very pale. This isn't over, no, Eli agreed. It isn't. The next morning, a letter arrived by certified mail. It was from a law firm in Nashville representing Crestline Holdings. It informed Eli Mercer that Crestline had filed a civil action against him, alleging slanderous public statements regarding their business practices and seeking damages of $400,000. Attached was a list of named parties expected to be deposed, including Penelope Brooks, Bart Sumner, the Whitakers, and Deputy Holland. The lawsuit was, on its face, ridiculous. It would also cost Eli more in legal fees to defend than the field damage alone. And it would drag every one of his neighbors into a courtroom in Nashville for weeks of depositions designed to grind them down. Eli sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him. He understood. He walked out to the west field alone that night. The moon was 3/4 full, and the corn, what was left of the corn, stood in silhouette, ragged and uneven. Some rows were still green, most were not. He walked to the place his grandfather had first plowed in 1887, and he sat down in the dirt. He thought about his daughter and the tightness in her voice on the phone. He thought about June asleep in the upstairs bedroom with the stuffed rabbit. He thought about Penelope, 71 years old, who would now have to sit through a deposition because she'd been kind enough to bring him muffins. He thought about Bart and the Whitakers, who hadn't asked for any of this. He thought about the army. about the times when you couldn't make the right answer happen and you had to make the least wrong answer happen instead, about the cost of pride when the cost was paid by other people. He thought about selling. He thought about it for a long time. He let himself imagine it all the way through. The signed papers, the check. Magnolia and June moving into a nice house in Knoxville with him in a small place nearby. Quiet. Safe. No lawsuits, no threats, no more nights sitting in dying fields. It would be easier. And then he thought of what his grandfather had told him, and what he had told his daughter. And he knew, sitting in that dirt, that some things you do not sell, no matter what it costs. He walked back to the farmhouse just before midnight. Penelope's mill across the field still had a light on in the kitchen window. He could see her shape moving inside, putting away dishes. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom and pulled a wooden box down from the closet shelf. It had been his grandfather's. Inside were papers older than Eli was, deeds, surveys, letters, photographs, and a leather-bound journal his grandfather had kept from 1955 to 1971. He sat down at the kitchen table, switched on the lamp, and opened the journal to the first page. Somewhere in here, he believed, was the thing they didn't know. He read until dawn. June came down the stairs at 6 in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes, and Eli made him oatmeal without looking up from the page. By noon, he had 3 things spread across the kitchen table. The journal, open to an entry from 1962, a yellowed county survey from 1934, and a handwritten letter from a man named Augustus Kemp, dated October of 1962, addressed to Eli's grandfather. Penelope came over at 1. He showed her what he'd found. The 1962 letter was the same offer. Different company name, Kemp and Whitford Land Co., but the same approach. A development firm wanted to buy the valley. Augustus Kemp had offered Eli's grandfather $60,000, an enormous sum at the time. Eli's grandfather had refused. Kemp had then attempted to force the sale by claiming a road easement that did not exist. And when that failed, by claiming the Mercer Farms water rights had been improperly recorded and were actually owned by an adjoining parcel Kemp had already purchased. Eli's grandfather, in his journal, had spent 2 months tracing the water rights back through every recorded transaction since 1887. He had found the original deed, hand-signed and witnessed, that explicitly granted the Mercer family perpetual water rights to the springs along the western ridge. He had taken that deed to the county courthouse and had it re-recorded with the original 1887 survey attached, and he had won. But the more important thing, the thing Eli had not known, was that in winning, his grandfather had triggered a clause in the original 1887 deed. The land had been granted to the Mercer family by an agricultural conservation society that had since dissolved, but the deed itself contained a covenant. Any attempt by an outside party to acquire the property through coercion, fraud, or misrepresentation would automatically transfer a permanent agricultural easement to the state of Tennessee, prohibiting non-agricultural development on the parcel in perpetuity. His grandfather had filed the paperwork to invoke the covenant in 1962. The paperwork had been signed and notarized. It had never been mailed. The unmailed envelope, still sealed, was in the wooden box. Eli held it in his hands and felt his grandfather very close to him in the room. He drove the envelope to Penelope's lawyer cousin in Knoxville the next morning. The cousin, a sharp-eyed woman named Octavia, read the journal, the letter, the survey, and the deed, and then she sat very still for a moment, and then she smiled. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "your grandfather has handed you a sword from beyond the grave. The covenant is valid. The trigger language is unambiguous. If we can show that Crestline Holdings has attempted to acquire your property through coercion or fraud, and the sabotage of your field, plus the retaliatory lawsuit, plus your audio recording, gives us a clear path to do exactly that, then this envelope becomes the most important document in eastern Tennessee. What happens to Crestline? Their development plans for this valley become legally impossible, permanently, and depending on what we can prove, The principals may be looking at criminal charges for the field sabotage. The next 6 weeks moved fast. Octavia filed a countersuit and a motion to invoke the 1887 Covenant. The state lab confirmed the herbicide match. Deputy Holland, with a court order in hand, accessed the Stricol registry and found that a regional applicator named Bowman Industrial Services had purchased a 20-gallon container of the compound on a date and at a location consistent with the sabotage. Bowman, when subpoenaed, produced an invoice. The invoice was billed to Crestline Holdings and signed by Sutton Vance. Vance, faced with the audio recording, the chemical trace, the invoice, and the looming covenant filing, agreed to a settlement before the matter reached open court. Crestline withdrew its lawsuit. Crestline paid Eli the full appraised value of the lost crop, plus the cost of soil remediation, plus Octavia's fees, plus a number for damages that Eli, after a long, quiet conversation with Penelope and Magnolia, agreed to accept on the condition that the Ag Covenant be permanently recorded against the property. The covenant was recorded on a Friday in late August. The valley, by that recording, became unbuildable for any purpose other than agriculture or conservation. Forever. Sutton Vance himself was indicted in October on charges of criminal mischief and conspiracy. The principal investors behind Crestline divested from the company within a month. The Nashville Tennessean ran a story. By that time the corn was gone, but the soil was already being treated. Sage Holloway brought a soil scientist down from the university who said that, with the right cover cropping over the winter, the Westfield would be plantable again by next May. Eli still had every kernel he needed in the loft of the barn, 41 years of careful saving. The seed line would continue. Magnolia came up the weekend the covenant was recorded. She brought June. She stayed 3 days, which became a week, which became a conversation with Eli on the porch about whether she could work remotely from the farmhouse if she set up an office in the upstairs sewing room. She had quit the Knoxville job. The custody issue had resolved in her favor. She was tired in a different way now. The tired of someone who had decided to put something down rather than the tired of someone still carrying it. "Daddy," she said, "can we come home?" He didn't trust his voice for a second. "This is your home." On a warm morning in late September, the whole valley came to the farmhouse for what Penelope called a covenant party, but everyone else called a thank you. Bart brought a pig he'd had smoking for 2 days. The Whitaker kids set up a long table on the lawn. Sage Holloway came with her husband and a peach pie. Deputy Holland came in his off-duty clothes. Penelope wore a sun hat the color of butter. June ran in circles among the adults, telling everyone about Glorp. Eli stood on the porch with a glass of sweet tea and looked out at his 80 acres. The corn was gone for the year, but the orchard was heavy with apples. The creek was clear. The hawk was still circling somewhere up above the south pasture, slow and patient, riding the warm air. He understood, finally, what his grandfather had been saying all those years. A man's worth is what he won't sell. The land had asked for nothing. He had given it everything. It had given everything back. The porch swing was freshly painted, sky blue. Magnolia had done it on a Saturday in October. Eli sat on it with June curled against his side, a blanket over their knees, the apple harvest finished and stacked in bushels along the rail. Across the field, lights glowed in Penelope's mill window. Somewhere up the road, Bart's cattle were settling for the night. A black limousine had once idled at the end of this drive. It was gone now, and no other would come. The covenant was recorded, the seed was saved, the family was home. Eli rocked the swing gently with his foot. The lightning bugs were rising again from the long grass. The wind moved through the new green of the cover crop. He listened.